The webinar is connecting to the Facebook.
Okay.
And we're now live.
Okay. Revolutionary greetings, comrades. My name is Vuyole Tutoli, the national spokesperson of the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party. Today, as we continue to celebrate, to mark the birthday of Comrade Commissar Filmore, he would have been born on the 26th of June, 1956. And then this year specifically, he was going to be turning 64 years. And in this particular challenging stage of the social and economic crisis, it is important than ever to look to those amongst us who never gave up hope in our ability to abolish the better system we live under and fought tirelessly for the revolution. Comrade Filmore lived and advocated the socialist values that all cadres must develop within them. From his political participation in the armed anti-apartheid and anti-colonial struggles, to his central contributions to the NUMSA movement and the creation of the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party, Comrade Filmore dedicated his life to expelling capitalism and imperialism in South Africa throughout the African continent and the world. In tonight's discussion, we'll reflect on the practical lessons learned in terms of his revolutionary praxis, building working class organizations, unifying the working class struggles on all fronts, and internationalism as a strategic necessity in the fight to defeat our common enemy, capitalism and imperialism. To help us unpack the lifetimes and the revolutionary legacy of Comrade Filmore, we are joined today by the national chairperson of the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party, Comrade Irvan Jim. Comrade Jim is a leader and a militant of the working class movement who began his political journey at a young age. During the dark days of apartheid, he participated and led in community struggles. He has spent most of his life in the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa in the working class movement in general, having started as a worker leader and played key various roles in serving the interests of working class. He is also currently the General Secretary of the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa and continues to be in the front line of battles in challenging the capitalist status quo. Comrade National Chairperson, welcome to tonight's discussion and reflection on Comrade Filmore's life and legacy.
Well, good evening, Comrade Vuyo, and greetings to comrades. I must say that I'm thrilled and indeed I'm very privileged to have an opportunity to say few things, and I guess it wouldn't be very wise that anybody, including myself, that we can actually monopolize how we shared this very important life, a life that was well lived, a life of a revolutionary, a life of a comrade. I think for me, what is extremely important first is to give a revolutionary salute, as we remember uPopo, Filmore, uMaqatha Khuni, into kaMpondo Zephela. Filmore was basically everything to the working class, and in particular to his family. He loved his family, he loved his wife, uMama kaNgcuza, noNcumisa. But generally, I think that beyond that family, Filmore belonged to a bigger family, the family of the working class. He was at an early age, he had to carry difficult tasks and missions. I mean, he grew up in church. He would have walked you through his early beginnings of knowing how to bedesha in the church in the true sense. And but over and above that, this became Filmore, who during the student movement in his early age, in the early 70s, where he basically had to skip the country because in the Portland area where he grew up, where like all of us, basically sharing a life of being a peasant and at the same time living an urban life in Port Elizabeth, where his family would have basically worked, and his parents. And Filmore, as I was saying, I think this is one comrade who basically chose side very early. And that side was to join the ranks of the struggles of the working class and the poor. And I think, as I was saying, I think it's very difficult to talk about Popo. I think Filmore was amazing. He was a natural, organic intellectual that would have thought in his feet and reflected and acted. And I think that I was fortunate to meet Filmore in the first ANC conference, which took place in 1991 in Durban. He was among the first MK cadres who basically came back home in that conference before armed struggle was uplifted. Comrade Chris Hani was in that conference. This was a very interesting conference in the history of the ANC, where basically formally in the country, the ANC at the time would have elected leadership inside the country as a struggle towards unbanning and to re-establish its own structures. I was a very young ANC, I was a very young ANC a member of the branch in the ANC Youth League at the time. I went into that conference representing the branch as an ex-official, but I ended up, because of my young activism, being given a task, being told by then that you would have to carry the task of taking Comrade Filmore back with you home. And it was interesting that when we arrived, he couldn't know exactly where was home. We hunted and hunted, only to find out his the sister to his father was just a neighbor at home. From that day, me and Makatal Kuni Kampondo Zepela, we had to adapt. He was part of setting up structures to basically around negotiations, talks about talks when the apartheid regime. And I think Filmore was the one who really unpacked for us what we would have been part of, but without some total of an understanding of the then 4 pillars of struggle, such as mass mobilization, underground structures of the then Liberation Alliance, the ANC, Umkondo Wesizwe, which Filmore directly participated on, and isolation of South Africa on trade, basically delivering the slogan that Oliver Tambo would have said, let's make apartheid to be completely ungovernable. Me and Comrade Filmore, with my activism in the community of Motherwell, where my youthful struggles were unleashed, we would have formed a Motherwell Development Forum, which basically was taking up community struggles in the community of Port Elizabeth, but in particular, for Motherwell in particular. And I mean, Comrade Filmore, we would have developed campaigns when there was a fellow who ran the municipality for the people of Motherwell. I still remember him. His name was Menkis. Where the first battle we had to fight, it was the battle to ensure that we deal with the making demands, mobilizing community, taking to the street, demanding that Motherwell must be given electricity, fighting water and electricity cutoffs in communities where basically electricity was connected, and that electricity would be cut off. And those battles led to Motherwell people basically accessing water, clean drinking water, people accessing electricity as a basic commodity which must be decommodified. Filmore led those particular struggles. In the evening, we used to have a forum called, we were meeting in a crash called Lutuli. The name of the crash was named Lutuli. And it was named after Lutuli, of the then ANC president. Filmore find us when he was back, because that's where we were raising levels of consciousness, having political classes, and so forth. And for me, this was a period when I was still a student and so forth. And we took those battles with Popo, and up to the actual democratic breakthrough of beginning to say, now that we have voted in 1994, how do we carry forward those particular struggles? And I think Popo was among the people after the elections who basically would have done a couple of things in stimulating debate and discussion. He was among the few people who quickly appreciated that, yes, we must continue to celebrate what was then called political democratic breakthrough. But he would have said theoretically, what was important over and above that was to take up the struggle, what was defined as a thoroughgoing national democratic revolution. He was among the people who said, but what we secured in this breakthrough, whilst we must continue to celebrate it, is the fact that we have secured political power without economic power. And political power without economic power, he basically characterized that very early as an empty shell. He was among the people who would have said national democratic revolution, yes, it must be the most direct route to socialism. But he was the one who said, but listen, the time has come for us to wake up, that this national democratic revolution is basically booby-trapped. It was Filmore who characterized that. The national democratic revolution was booby-trapped. And for him, this was not about the fact that he was rebelling against the line of the ANC or the alliance. No, he was saying, listen, the working class and the poor were not going to benefit anything out of this revolution. Those debates, comrades like Wile and many other comrades would remember, that led to a situation where in Cosatu at the time in the Eastern Cape, we would have begun to ask hard questions. What is the character of the state? And Filmore would have led us to read Lenin, to read Karl Marx, where Lenin and Karl Marx would have clarified us that a state in a capitalist mode of production is but nothing but an organ of oppression. That in fact, the dominant class, the ruling class that owns means of production, always re-establish its hegemony over the state. It is the working class that stand in queues to go and vote, and they elect a president. In our case in the country, as the African majority will always win these elections. And it was Filmore who said, you must wake up that very same president who was voted into power by the majority of the working class and the poor, become the CEO of the very same dominant class that super exploit the working class. So comrades, I mean, we're chatting here about Popo, who was with us when we would have actually demanded that we needed a revolutionary agenda. And we would have simplified that revolutionary agenda as about fully implementation of the Freedom Charter, in particular the economic clause. I mean, the Freedom Charter says mineral wealth beneath the soil, banks and monopoly industries shall be transferred to the ownership of the people. And we didn't see that could be realized without nationalizing commanding heights of the economy. We couldn't see how Freedom Charter can be realized without taking into ownership and control of all our minerals. And we were very clear that at the back of those minerals, we needed to champion a job-led industrial strategy, to champion beneficiation, to basically lend to some of the measures that the Nationalist Party would have taken, where basically the state intervened in the economy. And we're saying we needed a state now that was not going just to intervene for a tiny minority which we fought against. We needed a state that was going to intervene in the economy, to take ownership of the economy, to ensure that we control those mineral resources, to actually what Popper would have defined as being about changing power relations in society, so that the real non-racialism, non-sexism, and the democratic society, and building a society free of patriarchy, where we must deal with triple oppression. Filmore was not mincing its words about the need for us to wake up and appreciate that we have a struggle to wage against our own weaknesses. Key among that is this whole question that still basically overwhelms us today, that of us failing, in particular as males, to appreciate that we are still victims of patriarchy, that we regard female comrades as having a place somewhere you could be together as partners at work, but when you arrive home, you expect that your partner, your wife must be standing in the kitchen to prepare food. Filmore defied that. He believed that that was patriarchy. That was not the case. Umama kaNcuza will go and do a braai, and so forth and so forth. That was Filmore simplifying the importance of basically taking up the struggle against patriarchy. And he was very clear that, in fact, the struggle against patriarchy, the struggle against corruption was not a single battle in a single front. It was an all-sided struggle, in that we must fight against ourselves, in that we must actually fight against capitalism as a system, because capitalism as a system actually breeds all these social ills that continue to hold back what he used to call the wheels of history in terms of moving forward. And of course, Comrade Vuyo, there were serious moments. I think it was a very serious moment when the ANC, as the leader of the alliance at the time, when President Mandela came back after trips to Europe and said the market was the policy of the ANC. But when he walked out of Victor Flexter, he would have said nationalization is the policy of the ANC. And that meant that when GEAR was imposed, I was together with Filmore in the conference. We actually composed that song that said, Asifuni GEAR. I was still very fit and strong at the time, very young. I remember attending a funeral of Comrade Sheya Kulati, who was a militant communist like you, Comrade Vuyo, who was in the student movement, who led us when I was in my first few years at Port Elizabeth Technikon. He was at VETS. And what was the program then? The program was a fight against exclusion. We said in those days, there was a big issue that if you pass and you pass very weak, you might not be allowed to get into the university. We would have argued that as long as we passed, we must be allowed to get into the university, because we studied under very backward infrastructure. We had no time, by the way, to study. The police were in our case. We were toying. We wrote those exams under very difficult conditions. We fought exclusions in the universities. We had to take up struggles, I mean, the merger between Srwp and NUSAS at the time to form one organization, it was basically beginning to say, how do we ensure that we deliver free and compulsory education? That's why for me, it was shocking. It was a demonstration of a lack of a political will as a result of GEAR, that students had, in the recent past, had to have fees must fall. It was then, I still remember KK Papiane, Lincoln Mali, Kila Gavu, who basically led us in Srwp at the time, fighting against exclusion, saying what this country needed was a free and compulsory education. And Cde Filmore was with us, was in the locals of NUMSA, unpacking for all affiliates of COSATU then as to what was bad about GEAR. GEAR was bad, and it remains bad because it liberalized trade. It basically led to serious levels of deindustrialization in our country. GEAR is bad because it removed exchange control and allowed South African companies to list in Melbourne, in London, taking money which the country desperately needed to be invested in productive sectors of the economy to create the most needed job. I mean, a simple thing like saying ban exportation of scrap metal so that our foundries can still be able to employ many workers. If you go to the poor Eastern Cape, which have serious levels of deindustrialization, I remember that there was one foundry in Timbaza, which basically probably was the last, I think more than 10 foundries that used to employ workers in rural areas, they basically closed. And we are the only country that, as we remember, Upopo, which was a demand that he pushed that we needed to nationalize the Reserve Bank. We're the only country that still retain a Reserve Bank in private hands, and basically doing what? Basically pursuing a hot pursuit of inflation targeting, maintaining high interest rates. And why this was done? Clearly, this was done to ensure that you protect untransformed value of white wealth so that you don't tamper with concentration and centralization of wealth in this particular country. And I think today we're remembering Filmore under very painful conditions where the working class has been thrown globally into a vicious cycle of how brutal is the capitalist system. Filmore didn't mince his words. He knew that capitalism as a system has no solutions for problems that confront humanity. Popper was very clear that the future basically was to champion a class struggle as the only guarantee for change. But you can't do that unless you raise levels of consciousness of the working class. But the basic elementary step of that is to unite workers and the poor, is to link shop floor struggles with community struggles, is to make sure that we make it our duty and the responsibility as the working class to make sure that we deal with crime in our communities, to make sure that the current femicide where women are being killed, are being violated, and so forth, we make that as a struggle of young people, of everybody, both old and young. We must be united, that women must be able to walk freely at night and they must be safe. And during the apartheid era, by the way, we used to deal with criminals as with both young and old, because we will say in our communities, there will be no women who will be violated, who can't walk freely in our township. At 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, we used to patrol the streets and say, there's crime in this community. We got street and area committees, back to basics in our communities. You can't be a member, you can't be umhlali without being a member of street and area committees. You can't serve in a street and area committee when you are unfit. You can't stop a criminal who's breaking next door and so forth. Street and area committees were about neighborhood, where community 24/7 take care of each other. And on Sunday afternoon, the entire community, they take a chair and go and sit there. There's a street and area committee of that particular ward. He opened the meeting. We don't speak politics in those meetings. We are actually discussing basics. And of course, this was as a result of when the political parties were banned in the country. We sit there, we debate, how are we going to make sure that this community is safe? How are we going to make sure that young children in the community are able to go to schools, whether in that family there's somebody who work or who do not work, and those who work, they must take care of their families, yes, but as a community, we can take responsibility to make sure that in our streets, there will be no child who will not pass a matric. When he passes matric, we've got an added responsibility to make sure that he's got access to university. I still remember that when I passed matric, I couldn't have anybody to take me forward. I still remember one fellow called Dan May. He used to run a butchery. And I went to him and I said, I've passed now. He said, I'll give you, Ubra Dan May, he says, I will give you some access. And I'm just saying, Filmore is a product of being in a branch of a South African Communist Party then, and so forth. And it was Filmore who then walked with us. He never left NUMSA. Filmore walked the steps. And when we said the ANC must dump gear, when we didn't fight with anyone, we simply said, no, this thing doesn't work. This thing is destroying workers. This thing is not industrializing our country, this gear. And we said this alliance at the time was basically not helping the working class. In fact, when we were in COSATU, we would have called for a COSATU Congress democratically. The COSATU Constitution, we read the Constitution, it says, if a 2/3 of COSATU affiliates can actually go to the CC and suggest that we must convene a Congress. We were not fighting anybody. We were saying in the Federation, can we debate that this alliance was basically not helping the working class? Because we were, at the time, we were saying enough is enough. We're saying the time has come for the working class to organize itself as a class for itself. Because at the time, the masses were leaderless, they were leading themselves and so forth. It was Filmore and many of us who said, listen, we did it during the Nationalist Party. It was time to mobilize the people again. We didn't create any structure. We created a structure where anybody can join, and that structure was the United Front. That's what, together with Popo, we crystallized. We would have gone out and launched the United Front. But, you know, the NUMSA moment would have said, we needed to go beyond that. We needed to keep the unity of the working class in COSATU. If all failed, we needed to actually move ahead and launch a new federation for workers. Of course, I think the rest is history. We were expelled out of COSATU. We had to launch the SAFTU. And Popo was the one who drove impetus to make sure that the SRWP was launched. We remember him today, when in fact, the correct position would have taken then that neoliberal agenda of GIA, which basically said that the state has no business in business. We must allow the market to drive development, where GIA basically would have said, let's go for belt tightening. As a result, allocation by the National Treasury to depressed economic provinces would have meant that allocation to those municipalities are reduced. Today, if you go through the country to across 9 provinces, you go through those municipalities. Those municipalities today, it doesn't matter how many councillors you elect in every local government, but there is absolutely no revenue to be able to stimulate economic growth. Poverty is written in the faces of the people. And basically those rural towns have become ghost towns. And today, as I'm saying, we are now in an economic junk status as we remember, Comrade Filmore. Rating agencies have said this government must continue with those austerity measures. It must not spend money. It must not continue to stimulate economic growth. And I think, Vuyo, it's important as we remember, Filmore, to state that there are no socialist policies. There is no socialism that has been implemented in the past 2 decades. It has been neoliberal policies. It is the Washington consensus that has been executed with the National Treasury being at the center, with austerity measures. It is these austerity measures that have led our country to a collapse of a junk status today. And those who were priests of this neoliberal orthodox must take full responsibility out of this crisis. Not to despair and to continue to tighten. We think that a lot can be done. First is to appreciate both GEA and the NDP have failed us. I mean, NDP does not talk, it says nothing about restructuring South African economy. It says nothing about championing manufacturing and industrialization. In fact, it does not even list which sectors are you going to champion. If anything there, the jobs they talk about is window office cleaning and hairdressing. Those are the only jobs that basically do not even constitute hamburger jobs. So as we remember, Popo, I think it's important that there are critical sectors that we must fight, that those sectors must be defended. We must remember, Popo, by saying South African economy must be transformed. We must address still issues of ownership and control. And there are sectors that must still be owned by the public, such as steel, such as petrochemicals, such as energy. I mean, if we're not careful, all these SOEs are on their way to disappear. We must defend Eskom. I mean, it was Van der Bay of the Nationalist Party that in championing manufacturing, they made sure that Eskom was in their hands. They made sure that ISCO, which is ArcelorMittal, was critical in the hands of the state, both in upstream and in downstream, to create the most needed jobs of our people. We must make sure that education is free and compulsory. We must make sure that the land is in the hands of a democratic state that is voted by the people, and that land must be redistributed, and people must be able to have decent places to live. This nonsense we have seen this afternoon of a racist government of the Nationalist Party in Cape Town, where basically people are being evicted. I mean, we are dying of coronavirus. People are dying. A government that claimed to be caring about the people uses this moment, uses this afternoon to basically not to respect human lives, throw people to the street, expose them to worse conditions where they are going to be having a surge of infections. In fact, we must be calling for everybody to join us in the fight, that we might have to take a legal battle. And by the way, this is happening in Cape Town. This is also happening in KZN with Abahlali, where there are evictions that are taking place. When we remember Filmore, we cannot tolerate what we see taking place, because we will be acting out of Filmore. I mean, Filmore was very clear that a state that cares about the people, one of the things that should be made very cheap is to deliver quality houses. You can set up our communities where they must manufacture bricks, set them up into housing brigades. They build their own houses, put engineers and all technical people who must work with them, smash the squatter camps that are basically every winter our people are exposed. What is difficult to do that? Why don't you tax the rich to make sure that we got a program to build houses, and you use that to also create jobs? Make sure that the state intervene. We've got very productive land. People till land, give them tractors, give them seeds. That's what the Freedom Charter says. What is this thing that our people are subjected to poverty, unemployment, when in fact, we can actually say ban exploitation of chrome ore, and that China and don't export jobs to China at the back of smelters. Let's process our own chrome ore here into ferrochrome, create jobs, make sure that electricity is made and available cheap. And I know some people think that we want to keep ESCOM, we don't want to move from fossil fuels to renewables. No, that's not our argument as we remember Filmore. We're saying, yes, we must move from fossil fuels to renewables. But how do we do that? We must make sure that there is a just transition, there is a socially owned renewable sector. Such a movement must be at the pace and the time which the country can be able to afford. But open up the debate about energy sources. There must be no holy cows. Nuclear must be in the mix. Let's discuss gas must be in the mix. Let's discuss all these energies so that whatever energy mix we come up with, it must be the energy mix that address our people's needs. That include that's the same attitude we should be adopting towards the fourth industrial revolution. The concrete conditions we find ourselves must determine what's the nature of technology that we are going to adopt. We can't go for Rolls-Royce technology when in fact our people do not have jobs, but we must still be on the cutting edges of the latest technology and so forth. So, I mean, that's the crisis, as we remember, Comrade Filmore, that we are confronted with. And I'm just saying I decided to do that waffle because Filmore would have been deeply in those particular struggles. He would be advancing those particular views. In the afternoon on Saturday or Sunday, he calls the branch where he stayed. Filmore didn't walk out of the township. He was still, his house is still in the township. He would call his branch in the township there, engage with the branch, spread the ideas. That's what would have made Filmore happy. He dedicated his body and soul. In fact, him and Boy would have coined the struggle, that a slogan that says, there is no better cause like a cause of building organizations of the working class. I think that's how I would want to remember Popo.
Thank you very much, Comrade National Chairperson, for that rich and insightful background to Comrade Popo's life. He would have started back right from his family all the way to organizations, revolutionary organizations, but also how you yourself, together with him, developed in the working class organizations and their contributions. I am interested more in what you raised, Comrade National Chairperson, particularly on the question of the Freedom Charter. While noting that on the 26th of June, 1955, I understand that the Freedom Charter on that day was drafted. And 1 year later, 26 June 1956, Comrade Filmore is born. But as we continue to follow that development and what happens right through the apartheid era, as you have given the context, all the way to what happens in 1994, and the consistency of the economic apartheid, we realize even today, for instance, that things are not changing. In fact, Comrade Filmore himself says that what is to the capitalist class development is retrogression to the working class. So on the many fronts that you have actually outlined, what becomes, especially with Comrade Filmore's legacy in building working class organizations, what becomes the lessons that ourselves in revolutionary organizations building the working class, what are the lessons looking at his role, how he helped in crystallizing the organizations, strengthening them, fortifying them with the necessary political education and all other necessary means, because he was not merely a commissar in the sense that he was giving political education. He himself physically rolled his sleeves, participated in strengthening the working class organizations. What are the key lessons that, as revolutionary organizations confronted with all the objective conditions that capitalism is presenting, how do we begin to organize ourselves? There was a slogan which used to say, don't mourn, organize. How do we begin to organize, educate, agitate, mobilize the working class so that we're able to confront and deal with this system?
Well, I think that I must say from Filmore's perspective, unity of the working class is sacrosanct and compulsory. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, because these days, instead of producing individuals and cadres who are serious about championing unity, we sometimes produce what Oliver Tambo said, beware of the wedge drivers, people who are conscripted from mouth to mouth. Watch, in fact, he concluded that quote by saying, watch his poisonous tongue. Filmore used to be very poetic. And I don't think it has to do with Filmore alone. I mean, you can read Thabo Mbeki, the then ANC president, on the historical injustice. And I think many people says at the time, Thabo Mbeki was still steeped in the Communist Party. Not the South African Communist Party, I think the Communist Party of South Africa at the time. And I mean, he defined the Kliptown that you're asking me about almost poetically, looking at the volunteers who assembled in Kliptown in 1955. And I think we must read that 1978 historical injustice. That these were volunteers who assembled, who said the people shall govern, the people shall share in the country's wealth, the doors of learning and culture shall be open to all. These were not just demands that people slept and wake up and said, this is what we're taking to Kliptown. Volunteers, there was in fact, the old man from the Eastern Cape, I just forget his name. He would have said, Zemki inkomo magwalandini. This is a grouping of volunteers who move from house to house collecting the demands and the problems of the people. They went and assembled those demands in Kliptown in 1955. So what am I saying? I'm saying I think there is no replacement for building organizations of the working class that are rooted in taking up bread and butter issues, the burning questions that affect the people, develop programs, go and negotiate, mobilize the people, be with the people in taking up those particular demands and struggles. I want to argue that if the SRWP, if the organizations of the working class are to have any meaningful impact in the lives of the people, it's time to go back to basics. And I know now, Comrade Vuyo, we are stuck. I mean, we are doing this virtually. There's no agitation of the masses. We can't be more than 50. But I think that still remain, even as we are virtual, that we need to build organizations that takes up this bread and butter issues. By so doing is that I'm saying we shouldn't collapse in, there are people who can see the forest, but they won't see the trees. So it's very important that we must be able to anchor our own struggles to the people, because it is our people who are it is the working class that's going to move us from where we are. And Comrade Filmore was very clear. He was not mincing his words about this. He was saying that the working class is a material carrier. The working class is the only class capable of carrying the revolution to its logical conclusion. But not every working class can do that. It is the working class ekatulweyo. It is a working class with levels of consciousness, understand its class position in society. That basically in society, there is a fundamental contradiction between labor and capital. And that contradiction is about the fact that if you're a worker, you wake up in the morning to sell your labor, you get paid something called wages. And if you work for 8 hours, within 1.5 hours, you are paid what is due to you. The rest of other hours you give to the bosses for free. The struggle is about who owns that social surplus, which is about economic redistribution. The working class are the producers of wealth. They're not supposed to be dying like we see today in squalor, in poverty. The afternoon, you don't know, they are coming to smash you in Cape Town and to demolish where you must sleep. I mean, I can't understand. Where is humanity to what is taking place in Cape Town? How does DA explain to go to people who do not own means of production, who do not have a place to sleep, but you go and search for them in the afternoon with no warning, nothing, with no court saying this is a paper. You just rock in there. You almost like the old racist nationalist party. You tear apart naked a man in front of his children, as we have witnessed this afternoon. What's different between where we were during the apartheid racist past and where we are today?
Thank you, Comrade National Chairperson. One of the, I think, key lessons that I would draw from Comrade Filmore was the question of internationalism, his working class internationalism. He practiced it, especially in the context. For instance, there are a lot of international questions that ourselves as SRWP and a number of revolutionary organizations of the working class are confronted with. As we speak, there is an appetite by the Zionist and racist colonial Israel to annex further Palestine land, but also there is the United States and its allies, the imperialist aggression that it continues on countries who are pursuing at least socialism. There's a notion, there's a consistency by the United States to frustrate countries such as Venezuela and a whole lot of others where it wants the interest, it wants the material resources of those countries, and it wants to frustrate them. I'm interested to find out, one, how did Comrade Filmore, in the era of apartheid and colonialism in South Africa, right beyond that, how did he practice the internationalism? And for us today, what are the lessons that we can learn from that? Because we're confronted with these evils.
I think Popo was very smart, very defiant, very provocative. I mean, Popo would have worked for the South African Communist Party in the Eastern Cape, and because he basically say what he want to say and so forth, there was a time when he fell out of favor with the party, where NUMSA had to make Popo a local organizer. We employed him. I was still in the region at the time. I remember very well, there was one comrade who reminded us, I think it was Comrade Nko, that Filmore would have bought, when we employed him as a local organizer, he would have bought a car from Hyundai, knowing very well that we would have said, Filmore, where is local content on this car? So Popo would have maintained that, no, I'm an internationalist. He was not seeing any difference between workers of the world. In fact, he used to articulate a view that ours is non-national, ours is a classless world. Filmore hated xenophobia. Filmore hated the current fake borders that surrounded us in the African continent. He would have asked, where were you when these people, these imperialists and colonizers met in 1886 or 1884 in Berlin to divide this continent among themselves? Instead of us beginning to be victims of tribalism, regionalism, and everything else, all what was key to Popo was to unite the continent, pull together its resources, build an economy which benefit the peoples of South Africa, trade with the rest of the world in a mutual, fair way and equitable, champion the struggle for socialism, where is from each according to its need, to each according to this ability. And I think Filmore, we know, we would have basically deployed him anywhere in the struggle when we had to take up a campaign against the inferior blockade of by the United States, of Cuba, of Venezuela, and so forth. Filmore led those particular struggles. He was in the school where we educate cadres, basically presenting, giving lectures that basically are raising levels of consciousness about how important it is internationalism. And I guess that's the legacy that we, as the SRWP, as NUMSA, as the United Front, as Srwp, we must continue to champion. We must go back to basic, where we say we promote worker-to-worker conduct, union-to-union conduct, and that internationalism is our vision and the perspective.
Thank you, Comrade National Chairperson, for that. I'm trying to see, just from the different platforms, if comrades have any reflections or any brief questions they might want to put out there. But I think one of the things that you mentioned, and Comrade Filmore hammered on this question, was the question of struggling against our own weaknesses. And as Comrade Amilcar Cabral also raised that question prominently. Perhaps for us in the revolutionary organizations, in order to prepare subjective factors, what are the values, socialist values, ethics, and a whole lot of other revolutionary principles that maybe briefly you would want to highlight for us from Comrade Filmore's life?
Well, I guess there is no blueprint in building an organization. But I think as a matter of principle, the best way that one believes in is to ensure that organizations must have structures from where we should all be able to debate, discuss. Filmore believe in what we call democratic centralism. Not everybody likes democratic centralism. I mean, I must say that NUMSA is structured in that way. The SRWP is structured in that way. And many of other organizations we are privileged to serve. And those structures, first debate and discussion can be ignited or stimulated from the center, or it can start from below. But when finally the center takes a decision, that decision should be binding to all of us and the lower organs. But what is important is that in building the organization to ensure unity and hegemony, when you are presented with an opportunity in a particular structure, in a meeting, stand up in the meeting, raise your views inside the organization, debate them robustly, make sure that that particular structure takes a view. And once that is done, you know that you are done to keep quiet in the meeting and then talk behind the comrades. That does not help unity and hegemony of the organization. But of course, our organization must be dynamic, must be flexible, but we must make sure that we continue to defend decisions that are now final, which must be defended. If you still got an issue, you can wait for another round to basically lift up those particular issues. I think that Filmore subscribed to that. He believed in that once decisions are taken, let's all go all out there and implement the campaign. And I think in remembering Filmore, we have got a lot in our hands, which is to make sure that we build a strong SRWP, a strong NUMSA, a strong Srwp, a strong United Front that is rooted in taking up working class struggles and so forth. I mean, Filmore believed in vanguardism. He believed that the advanced detachment of the working class must actually be in the front, must be in the middle, must be at the back, must generally guard the revolution. But he was very clear that vanguardism doesn't mean that you sleep in your house because you are the national chair, and then you want to dictate to everybody when you are not getting your hands, you are not on the ground, you are not struggling with the masses, and so forth. In other words, you can only vanguard when you get your hands and when you are on the ground and you continue to give the line. So it's a dynamic process that we're talking about.
Thank you very much, Comrade National Chairperson. I think on that note, we can end our discussion. It has really been a very rich one, but also informative. You helped us a lot in understanding Comrade Filmore back then, prior, even to the times, as a young comrade who even before the time would have gone to exile and so forth. But even after 1994, because the class project, as they called the GEAR, and all the policies that since then have been ravaging the working class, there's a lot that we have learned through what we have shared, Comrade National Chairperson. I think with those words, we can end this particular session. Thank you very much for your time, and let's continue to fight.
Many thanks. Thanks, Comrade.
Okay, many thanks, Comrade.
I saw.